I want to welcome everybody to coming this evening. My name is Sonia Starr, and I'm the Policy Director at Housing Alliance Delaware. And this evening's program is really part of Faith and Housing Justice Week, which started last Friday and will end this Wednesday. And it's a week-long opportunity for faith communities across the state to discuss how housing instability applies to them in a variety of ways within their state, within their community. And tonight we thought we would do something we hadn't done before. Father Burke and Reverend Fields were kind enough to join me to have a conversation about what are the theological implications or foundations that have led us to work within the housing sphere. So I'm really excited about this interfaith dialogue that we're about to have. And we thought when we were planning this that I would just give you a few statistics. Mostly tonight is not about numbers, but just to paint a little bit of the picture about how we are in this affordable housing crisis, which has created exorbitant high rental costs, which has created significant amount of evictions and a rise in the number of people experiencing homelessness in the state of Delaware and across our country. So we are currently 20,000 units short of affordable and safe housing for low-income folks. That's mostly our child care workers, our home health aides, our nursing aides, our teachers' aides, our cashiers, our waiters, waitresses, the people who barely make minimum wage or slightly above it. And they didn't do anything wrong. We are literally just short units, and that's not people, that's units. It costs $30 an hour to rent a 2-bedroom apartment in the state of Delaware. So most of those people don't make $30 an hour or even close. And then the last statistic that I'll share with you, just to show how dire this situation is, of the people who are homeless, 25% of them are 18 or under. People who did not cause the problem cannot get themselves out of the problem and will have lifelong trauma because of being homeless, because being homeless is traumatic. So that just kind of paints a little bit of the picture of why we're in this, why this is a crisis, both a lack of affordable housing as well as has created a homeless crisis as well for our communities across the state of Delaware. In addition to being the policy director at Housing Alliance, I am also an ordained rabbi, and I was a congregational rabbi outside of Delaware for 27 years before I changed jobs, moved to Delaware, and became the policy director. It'll be 3 years in March. So that's kind of a little bit of an introduction to me, a little bit of an introduction to the crisis. And I thought I would turn it over to Father Burke or Reverend Fields, whichever one of you wants to go first, to introduce yourselves, and then we'll get into a little bit of a dialogue.
I guess that was me taking the microphone first. Welcome, everybody. My name is Patrick Burke. I'm an Episcopal priest. I serve as the rector at the Episcopal Church of Saints Andrew and Matthew, or SAM, which is right in beautiful downtown Wilmington. I've been at SAM for a little over a year. Came here from serving my last parish in the Indianapolis area. And just a couple things about why this is important work for me, both as an individual and as a priest. As a priest at SAM, when I was looking at the congregation and exploring Wilmington, it was really clear right out of the gate that the situation with those living in poverty and those who are unhoused was very evident when I was visiting the city, when I was looking at the demographics and speaking with members of the congregation. So I knew this was going to be one of the largest pieces of our ministry when I was exploring. So from a congregational standpoint, it's a really, really important issue because it is happening right at our block, right in our front yard. We serve quite honestly, over 100 people usually on any given Sunday that come through for hospitality. We host the Wilmington Empowerment Center from Friendship House in our building as well. So it's a ministry that is right in our wheelhouse and right on our doorstep. Individually, I'll just share a brief story. I grew up Roman Catholic, so I grew up with Roman Catholic social teaching, which has kind of influenced me theologically since I was young. But while I was in the formation process to become a priest, I was doing youth ministry with a group of kids from a suburban church in outside of Indianapolis, where there was no housing issue other than folks who were struggling to stay in apartments. It just wasn't that kind of location. And we took them on a mission trip to Washington D.C. with a program that's no longer there called Youth Service Opportunity Program. And uh, at the end of that trip, and it's a trip that was focused on youth and helping them understand what happens with folks in poverty, why the not just the symptoms, but really what are the causes and what can be done about it. And at the end of that trip, these kids, all of our lives were changed over the course of that trip. But the last night we were there, they took all the food that we had left over and they made sandwiches, and we were taking them out. This is 9 o'clock at night, and a couple blocks from the White House. And we had gotten to know all the folks that were living in the door openings and all the places around that area where folks sleep during the summer. And I just remember we're sitting there handing out, sandwiches and drinks, and a priest walked by in a nice suit and a collar, walked right by all these folks who were sitting there on the streets, did not make eye contact, and it just really changed my understanding of, here were these kids living out what I thought were our deeply held values, our faith values, and that was not what we were seeing in practice at the time. And so it just really shaped my understanding of how important it is for not only us individually as members of faith communities, but for the faith community and ordained clergy in particular to really be on the forefront of that work. So it's just something that really shaped my understanding of where the church can and should serve. Appreciate being here.
Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you, Sonia, for this conversation. I am Corey Fields, the pastor of Calvary Baptist Church in Newark, Delaware. I've been at this post for 8.5 years now. Before that, I was an associate pastor at First Baptist Church of Topeka, Kansas, for 10 years. I am not from the Midwest. I have no roots or family out there. That's just where my first full-time call was, but it was a great 10 years, and Topeka is an underrated place. It's a great place to raise a family. There are many different versions of Baptist. I am of the American Baptist variety, American Baptist Churches USA, which is actually the most ethnically diverse Protestant denomination in North America, even though it's much smaller than other Baptist groups. In Topeka, just as a couple of pieces of relevant background, in Topeka, I was one of a dozen or so founding pastors of a faith-based direct action nonprofit that was kind of, we got help organizing it from people from the DART Center, that stands for Direct Action and Research Training, and they kind of specialize in bringing people of faith together around doing local justice work. So I was one of the pastors that said yes to helping get that started and getting my church on board. The organization still exists today with more than 20 member churches. It's called Topeka Jump. You can look it up. Jump stands for Justice and Unity Ministry Project. And that was, through theological training and other more informal things, I had been interested in justice and had seen what a huge theme it was in the Bible. That was my first kind of more long-term and committed work in that area. I was attracted to this church here in Newark because of, well, for a number of reasons. One being their very hands-on work with unhoused populations. I found it inspiring what they were already doing. I liked that I didn't have to convince them to work with the poor necessarily. And I also have a connection to Friendship House in that not only that my congregation is a close partner with them, but I'm on their board of directors currently, and get to work with Kim and some of the amazing staff that they have. So those people are about that work, but one of my primary interests, like I said, has been the work of justice, which is, you know, a little different from, actually a lot different from the mercy ministries that we might do, as I call them, you know, which are also very, very important. Feeding someone today, housing someone today, that kind of thing. But I'm much more drawn to trying to address the root causes, the systemic issues, and the complicated people power work that entails. So although it's not a very sophisticated effort right now, one of the things I do in Newark is I convene the interfaith group, and there's kind of an interfaith coalition trying to work on some housing solutions. And one call in particular that we have right now is we want to see Newark adopt an inclusionary zoning ordinance to mandate that at least 10% of new housing developed would be affordable. We're not there yet, but they're at least talking about it. And that's probably enough for an introduction.
Thank you both. We're a small crowd, so we have a couple of questions to kind of begin the conversation, but I want to encourage people to also feel comfortable to raise your hand. And if you want to contribute to the conversation from your own point of view, or if you have your own questions. To kind of kick us off, though, we thought we would start with, what are key scriptures that call to us, and what do they demand of us? So I'm going to let one of the two of you go first this time.
One thing we didn't decide is who's going to go first on these
I was gonna
questions.
say, I went first the first time.
Yeah, so we'll alternate maybe. Okay. Well, in terms of, so there are some key passages, but to throw out some kind of more isolated passages that are kind of my favorite verses, that are ones that call me out to do the work of justice, including housing. Proverbs 31, 8 and 9, speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, for the rights of all who are destitute, defend the rights of the poor and needy. Jeremiah 22 has some good ones. This is what the Lord says: do what is right and just, rescue from the hand of the oppressor the one who has been robbed, do no wrong or violence to the foreigner, the fatherless, or the widow, and do not shed innocent blood in this place. There's also a great passage in there that actually addresses wage theft, among other things. It says, woe to him who builds his palace by unrighteousness, his upper rooms by injustice, making his people work for nothing, not paying them for their labor. I know some of you on here will be familiar with Amos 5. I despise your religious festivals, but let justice roll on like a river and righteousness like a never failing stream, famously quoted by Martin Luther King Jr. Two more that I think two more that I'll mention, and I'll pass the torch. Micah 4 is another one. It starts off saying, come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, he will teach us his ways. But it's one of the passages that says, that has the vision of, they will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. That's a vision of peace and shalom, and of turning weapons of war into tools of agriculture. But there's another great part about that passage. It says, everyone will sit under their own vine and under their own fig tree, and no one will make them afraid. That's a beautiful vision of dignity and self-determination. And that has to be a part of this work. And that's a big part of the work of housing. Someone who doesn't have a place to live has no dignity and no self-determination, and are not living under their own vine and under their own fig tree and enjoying the fruits of their labor. So I've always been inspired by that vision. Not to go on too long, but the organizing passage that we used to use in Topeka is Nehemiah 5. And I should have said, by the way, this is an interfaith conversation. I use Christian translations of the Hebrew Bible when I'm quoting from that part. You know, it's people may have versions that don't quite line up, but in Nehemiah 5, there's kind of this scene where the people come to Nehemiah here in the building of the Second Temple period, and they're crying out about injustices, about they can't afford things. They're having to sell their children into slavery and all of these. They don't have any dignity or self-determination. And in this passage, Nehemiah gathers people kind of in like a town hall. It says he gathers everybody, the common people, some power brokers were there, and he kind of just publicly calls out the issue, and says, this is unjust and we need to do something about it, and kind of does that call to action in front of everybody. And when I was a part of that work that I mentioned in Topeka, we called our assemblies at the end of the year cycle that we did Nehemiah Action Assemblies for this very reason, because that's exactly what we were trying to do. We were trying to gather a lot of people together. News media would be a bonus, and call out a problem and ask for a solution that we had worked out and talked about to that problem. So using that as a model. Now, I quoted all passages from the Hebrew Bible. Since I'm a Baptist, I should just quote at least one from the New Testament. A lot of the New Testament assumes the Hebrew Bible, which is important. But in Matthew 23:23, Jesus is talking to a group of religious leaders of his day, and he says, "You have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness." And in my mind, that's Jesus referencing Micah 6:8, which says, "What does the Lord require of you but to act justly, love mercy, and walk humbly?" Father Burke.
I love it. So this is where you'll get my Roman Catholic upbringing and my Episcopalian. I am not the biblical scholar that Pastor Fields is, but I would echo Micah 4 and 6 as well, being foundational for me. I would also add Isaiah chapter 58. Is this not the fast that I choose, to loose the bonds of injustice, to undo the thongs of the unjust, and to let the oppressed go free? And as it goes down in that scripture, you're to bring the homeless to your home. You're to feed those who are hungry, but also then your light shall break in like the dawn. It's a vision of what the world can and should be, and that we are called to live into that, to do that. To go a little bit farther in Matthew chapter 25, starting verse 31, the parable of the sheep and the goats, and the sheep and the goats. It's been a long day. And many times we hear this passage. It's when I was hungry, you fed me. When I was thirsty, you gave me water. But it really speaks to me of not just the act of doing compassionate care ministries, or what I would call them, taking care of the immediate needs. But there's a vision in that whole parable of, again, what the world can be like if we live justly with one another. And so that speaks, maybe not as directly to doing some of those justice pieces, but at the foundation is how we treat each other. I would also echo in Nehemiah, Corey, you'd appreciate. I took a community organizing course where we dissected Nehemiah for an entire week as foundational to the work of community organizing, to seeing the problems that the community has, lifting them up through within the community and solving them as a community together. And so I always think of that whole book and thinking about especially when we talk about doing community work around housing, building coalitions. I mean, Nehemiah organizes the entire community to rebuild the wall and to do that work together for the safety, for the well-being of the entire community. And so it's a reminder to me, even though that text seems like it's a whole lot of just tasks that are done, it's really about bringing the community together to solve the problems for the community and empowering them to do so. So I love that. I hadn't thought about that initially when I was thinking of my answer, but when you brought it up, I was like, yeah, that is one of those foundational texts for the work, the actual work that we do, even if it's not the richest theological work in some ways, but yeah.
So thank you both. When I started to think of my own answer, what occurred to me was I can either do what you all did and come up with many verses in many places within the Bible, or I can actually lift up a mystical tradition in Judaism, which is that you pick a verse any given day. And actually, if you do the tradition correctly, you literally open the Bible and see where it falls. And that verse then is there to teach you what you need to learn today, that day. So for whatever reason, I loved all the verses you all picked that I knew, but the one that was calling me when I was thinking about today was Deuteronomy 30 verses 11 through 14, which say, "Surely this instruction which I enjoin upon you this day is not too baffling for you, nor is it beyond your reach. It is not in the heavens that you should say, Who among us can go up to the heaven and get it for us and impart it to us that we may observe it? Neither is it beyond the sea that you should say, who among us can cross to the other side of the sea and get it for us and impart it to us that we may observe it? No, the thing is very close to you, in your mouth, in your heart, to observe it. Now, the thing that they're talking about in Deuteronomy is the commandments. Whatever you define as the commandments would be another whole topic for an interfaith discussion at a different time. But they mean the commandments. And when I think about how we treat people who are either homeless or unhoused or living doubled up or cost burden because they have to decide whether to pay rent or pay for medicine because they don't have enough money to get both, we often say the problem is so big and so complicated. How can we solve it? Or, it's really somebody else's problem. It's really, big farmers. It's really, big companies. It's really the government. There's a lot of other people we can blame for the problem. And when I think of this verse, it reminds me that it's not my job to blame someone else for the problems, nor is it my job to try to say I can't deal with it because it's just too complicated, right? In Sussex, they say it's the developers, but rather it's my jobs to figure out what it is that my heart and my mouth and my mind and my hands are called to do to solve it in my piece of it. And so for me, this portion in Deuteronomy, which we would call Nitzavim, so in my head, I'm translating, I'm thinking, Nitzavim, no, Deuteronomy 30. This passage that we refer to a lot is really about how do we partner with God to create the kind of community we want on this earth, rather than pushing it off so that somebody else has to do it and nothing changes. So that was the verses that called to me today. If you ask me the question tomorrow, it'll probably be a whole nother set. One of the things we were talking about as we were preparing for today is what is the connection between prayer and action, or scripture and action, and what is the purpose of prayer and or the purpose of scriptural study, and how does that connect to what we do with our lives? Either of you want to go first, or you want me to go first? What would you like?
I'm happy to go since I trade back and forth. So for me, prayer really has two principal pieces for me in this work. One is, prayer for me is a connection with God. Whether it's contemplative or intercessory, it's a moment to connect with God and to have God fill up my well. So there's a piece of that is turning my heart over time to be more closely aligned with God's dream for the world, for God's dream for me. And that it's that slow turning of my heart to change how I view things, how I act, how I speak. But part of that turn is a turn to action, because that turn, if it's just myopic, it's not actually accomplishing what God has set forth for me. So when I really get into a place of deep connection through prayer, I generally come out of that inspired to do something. And so it's a both, a not really a passive, but a self-reflective change, but it turns into an active change in the world over time. Sometimes it's rather quick, but usually it's something that shifts over time, understanding where God is calling me or calling our community. But it is both a self-reflective change and a change of heart into action over time.
Sonia, I think you're next this time.
So, happy to go next. It was an interesting question. It made a lot of sense when we were discussing it until I started to think about myself and the answer to it, because I've had a rather complicated relationship to prayer and less of a complicated relationship to action. So finding out the connection has been a lifelong journey for me. I grew up in a family that defined being Jewish as being part of the politically left. I went to civil rights marches and strollers. So, and their identity as a Jew was connected to the social justice piece of being Jewish. So that was always part of my life. Prayer wasn't so much part of their life, and took me a while to get there. And part of it is I envy that kind of relationship that you feel so strongly, Patrick, with God, because I feel more like a God wrestler than a God believer. And so I believe that there's something bigger than us. I believe there's something that connects us. Whether I believe that something knows my name or that I'm talking to that something, I don't know. I'm so important. And actually, rather that person or that entity or that being was thinking about something a whole lot more important than me. There's a lot of other issues that could be solved. And yet prayer is become, over the last X number of decades of my adult life, an intricate part of my life, because it consistently centers me and grounds me and gives me room to shut out all the other noise and reminds me of the values that gird that action. So for me, prayer is a reminder. What am I praying about? I'm praying about gratitude. How do you have gratitude if you don't have the sustenance of life? If I'm praying for peace or justice, what does that mean if I'm not working for peace and justice? It's a reminder of the values that I then need to wake up the next day and go out and do something about to the best of my abilities.
Yeah, so there's all kinds of pithy quotes that talk about how we have to be willing to be a part of the answer to our own prayers, right? But I think on a deeper level, what Father Burke was talking about is that alignment. That's one of the key things that prayer does, that alignment with the priorities of God and what we believe God wants to do and is about when it comes to people and justice. I want to come at it from this angle, though. Prayer has actually gotten a little bit of a new bad reputation, especially when it's partnered with the word thoughts and prayers, right? Because that is now seen and used as a way to get past action, bypass action. And especially when it comes to gun violence, but I think we could widen that out, and a lot of people like to say, oh, these people of faith who claim that they care and that claim that they're pro-life or whatever it is, all they offer is thoughts and prayers, right? And I do not blame the general public for that sentiment at all, given what they've seen, given what they haven't seen from people of faith. But I also have seen, even fellow clergy kind of join in this litany that kind of embedded in that is kind of a careless devaluing of prayer. Like I want to reclaim prayer, and not make it just this part of something else that people do with their thoughts that bypasses action. Action is supremely important to me, but I want to reclaim prayer and argue that it's not just something that accompanies action, but it is embedded with it and is our most meaningful foundation for it. Prayer makes a lousy noun, but a great adverb. That's one way I think about it. So prayer, it's never been meaningful to me, actually, at least since I was a kid, to think of prayer as something an action that I take that is only happening in between dear God and amen. Okay. I just don't relate to that way of understanding prayer anymore. That's prayer as a noun. I want to think of prayer as an adverb, or how we do something prayerfully. Like, let's just not pray, but let's do everything that we do, including this work, prayerfully. And what a difference it would make if we walked more prayerfully, spoke more prayerfully, worked and served more prayerfully. Baptist pastor on the call, quoting a rabbi here, Rabbi Nissan Mendel said, God does not need our prayer. God can do without our prayers, but we cannot do without our prayers. And there's that realignment piece. So if I had to say, I kind of have 3 quick bullet points on how prayer aligns with action. Number 1, it's how we acknowledge our dependence on something outside of ourselves. And that something outside of ourselves being the author of love, and justice. The Catholic Church Catechism says, whether we realize it or not, prayer is the encounter of God's thirst with ours. That relates directly to what Father Burke was saying. Number two, through prayer, it's only through prayer that we can fully see the image of God in the other for whom we advocate or whom we serve. And number three, prayer can serve as the most powerful way to remember and validate victims of violence and trauma, including the trauma of being unhoused. I've put some of these thoughts that I've just shared in an article that I will post a link to in the chat in case any of you are interested.
Thank you both. You know, as you were talking, Reverend Fields, it reminded me of Abraham Joshua Heschel, who had marched with Reverend Martin Luther King in Selma, which is a really, that sentence doesn't mean something unless you know something about his religious life. He was a pretty traditional Jew. The march took place on a Saturday, which was his Sabbath. Normally, he would have been in the synagogue and would not have been doing political activism. Now, he did political activism his whole life, but he would have done it the other 6 days, not on that day. He decided that day, what he said is, marching in Selma was my way of praying with my feet.
Yeah.
And that image, when you were talking of how do we make prayer into an, you said adverb or an action, right? Into combining that in a wholeness. Whenever I think of him talking about praying with your feet, I think about he was praying in that moment. It was his Sabbath, and he was enacting that through that march because he felt that march was so important. It just reminded me of that. Thank you.
Yeah.
Sonia, can I just interject too, and just
Please.
when you referenced wrestling, prayer is wrestling. I just want to lift up that that concept, because there's an element there of both the interaction with God and the interaction with self, and that, you know, trying to figure out what to do, why to do it, how to do it, and prayer is such, it really dovetails with what Pastor Corey was talking about, like prayer as the foundation for why we're doing it. You figure that out in that quiet solitude with God, and at the same time, that becomes, I think, when we pray in community too, that can be such a powerful way. I think about I went to Shaker High School, so Anabaptist, you know, thought and practice, that kind of idea of coming together as a community and sitting in prayer together until the Spirit moves you to what the right answer is. And so that sense of wrestling for the type of work we're talking about, I don't think we can coalesce around not only how to do something, but why to do something without really engaging in that form of wrestling. So I just want to lift up the way you phrased that was beautiful. I appreciate it.
I plagiarized it. God Wrestling was not mine.
No, no.
It's the title of a really good
You
book.
do look like
I
Jacob, though. I
strongly
mean,
recommend. But I'll take credit for how I adapted it in the moment. One of the things we were talking about is we were talking about prayer and justice work and advocacy work was then, well, how does separation of church and state fit into that? Right? It sounds like we're saying that there is no separation of church and state. And yet, I think I can say confidently, the three of us pretty much advocate in the public sphere, there should be a separation of church and state. So is there a disjunct there? And actually, if you guys don't mind, I thought I'd go first with this one.
please.
Because my perspective might be a little different going through the public school system as a minority person of faith. And because I'm old enough, these are gray hairs I earned honestly. And back in the day, my public school prayed in Jesus's name, had Christmas trees in the hallway, required us in music class to sing hymns, not Santa Claus is coming, but actually religious hymns. My mother had to write notes to the school saying I was not allowed to sing those songs. Otherwise I would get degraded. You know, my grade would go down. And I've had teachers at first place call me a Hebrew instead of a Jew, which is nothing somebody Jewish would ever say, because a Hebrew is the language, not the person. But then asked me if I still did sacrifices in my backyard. And I've had kids throw pennies at me because we know that Jews only care about money because we're lenders in the temple period, and therefore aren't I going to go diving for the pennies, and came home to swastikas. So my perception of separation of church and state is based on being discriminated against in the public school system, not because my entity, myself, is a separation of church and state. Within me, there is no separation between church and state. Within Sonia, within my community, but within my public community, there has to be, otherwise there's no place for me. And it's been very interesting moving to Delaware, from Maryland, where in Maryland there was a robust interfaith community and a robust in the public school system. National religions were taught. Understanding different religions was taught as a requirement as part of the public school. So there was an understanding of different faiths and how to be part of a community with different faiths. And moving to Delaware, where I have adults who come up to me and say, "What do you mean Jews don't believe in Jesus?" Or, "What do you mean you don't celebrate Christmas? And how can you be a person of faith?" So the worlds feel like it hasn't changed all that much. I might have moved in different locations, but there's a piece of the world that still doesn't understand that individuals can be completely united in church and state within themselves, but the only way we preserve the diversity within our larger community is by a true separation of church and state.
I'm really glad you went first on that one, Sonia. Thank you for that reminder. Yeah, so just to reaffirm, I also, as someone who knows my Baptist history, am very much a strong proponent of the separation of church and state. A lot of people don't realize that there were early Baptists that were kind of in the fight for the separation of church and state and writing it into the Bill of Rights. I'll just quote you one. Isaac Backus, second half of the 18th century, wrote, "When church and state are separate, the effects are happy, but when they have been confounded together, no tongue nor pen can fully describe the mischiefs that have ensued." And since Sonia was sharing a testimony of the mischiefs that kind of hit her as she was growing up, and it's 2024 and we still haven't figured this out. It drives me batty. But when it comes to people of faith being involved in advocacy, and I get this question, by the way, I was one of the ones that brought it up in the discussion, because people will say, "No, wait a minute, you want to organize people of faith to get, in many cases, to get the government to do something. Isn't that a violation of separation of church and state?" No, because we are not asking for special favors or treatment for our religion. It's not about us at all. It's not about our religion. The role of faith is our motivation, and anybody and everybody comes to their society and goes to their voting booth with their faith or their values or whatever that is for them. And so when people of faith come together because of their faith to advocate for people in their society and to do something for the common good, they happen to be people of faith. They're not asking for special favors. It's not any kind of violation of the Establishment Clause. And politics, people say stay out of politics. So politics comes from the word polis, which really means the affairs of the city and its people. And I'd like to remind folks that if you say, "I don't get into politics," what you're saying is that you prefer to let other people make life-affecting decisions for you and your community. I believe that my faith calls for the good of all, and it's perfectly acceptable, if not needed and expected, for me as someone of faith to rally others of like mind, especially in an interfaith setting, to do this work. So I mean, just in case that's helpful, I don't know if anyone on the call would be one of those who are like, wait a minute, what about this? Because I do get that question, but that's my perspective on it.
It's interesting to go last out of this group because, as the Episcopalian in the room, we draw our roots from the Church of England, which would have been the church-state entity that, quite frankly, oppressed both Baptists and Jews over the course of history, and were that the way the Church of England operated in colonial times is exactly one of the reasons why we have the separation. You know. Uh, uh, Now I lost my word, but embedded into the Constitution. So from that standpoint, I agree completely with both of what you were saying. And unfortunately, my tradition has been at the root of why we need that protection to begin with. With that said, I would affirm, Pastor Corey, what you've said about using our faith in the public sphere, and having most recently been in Indiana, but I think we're seeing the same type of religious fervor in the political sphere now more broadly than even just where we were in Indiana, where you know people have used religion for politics for many years. Um, and so I would argue that our religious faith is exactly as Pastor Fields is describing. We're using it as a basis for the policy changes that we want. We're using it to animate, we're using our values and our beliefs to animate our action and our call to action. And so it's less about separation of church and state as it is how our values are put into the public sphere, where church and state, to Sonia's point, the separation of church and state is about protecting the ability for individuals and communities to worship as they feel called to do and according to their own faith. So that's my response when that issue comes up, because I've also had it too. Usually it is from folks who are in the. I used to do a lot of state house testifying when I was in Indianapolis because it was also the seat of government, and um, I would get this from folks who were there to argue the opposite point, who also claimed Christian background. I was in a collar and they weren't. And isn't it a separation of church and state issue for you as a member of the ordained clergy to get up and talk about this? No, that's part of our responsibility as people of faith, is to ensure that our values and our faith, our relationship with the divine, however you feel that in your heart and in your belief system, they should animate us to want to see change in the world. All three of us had scriptures as our theological grounding that talk about making change in the world. That is part of all three of our faith traditions to do that. So I I always find that question to be indicative too of the misunderstanding from a civics perspective of what those protections are for. And I'll just lift up briefly that raising a First Amendment issue with currently asking the Wilmington Police Department locally to stop treating people in the manner that they're doing, to stop infringing on our rights as a faith community to serve the community in the way that we are called to do, that we are calling on the separation of church and state at using the protection for what it was designed for to begin with, which is to stop the state from infringing upon us from practicing our faith beliefs. Because unfortunately, to both of your points, the state historically has been in Western European cultures, the state has been involved in supporting the majority faith tradition and suppressing or oppressing minority faith traditions. So.
Well, we have one more question. We have a concluding question that if we still have time, whatever, we didn't talk about when this is ending. So whenever people start to drop off, we'll have one more. But we have one more question that we developed, and then we want to hear questions, comments, thoughts from each of you as well. In light of that discussion of church, separation of church and state, and what it means to advocate from the place of faith, why have interfaith programs? What is the purpose of interfaith programs? What does that add to our community and to us individually? And I'll let one of you start first.
Okay, well, my answer is pretty short. The more the better.
Mhm.
We need a lot of people at this party.
Mhm.
Because the work of justice, a lot of it comes down to people power. Um, you know, you have different kinds of relationships. You have interpersonal relationships, you have relationships of choice, and you have relationships of necessity. And it's the relationships of necessity where um, you are going to need a broad coalition of people to come together and ask for change. So the more the better, and it makes a whole lot of sense to me for people to come together, people who might otherwise disagree with each other on certain things, to work together on the things that they can work together on, particularly social issues and the good of their communities. You know, I mean, so Sonia and I wouldn't agree on the identity of Jesus. Father Burke and I wouldn't agree on when to baptize people. I wouldn't agree with I wouldn't agree with the Muslim imam about whether or not Jesus was crucified. But we all want people to have the dignity and self-determination of a home. And so let's work together.
Yeah. So very similarly from the practical perspective, absolutely. Coming together as interfaith partners certainly empowers us to create power in the community organizing model, coming together around shared values, around shared dreams and goals for the community. And as Pastor Fields alluded to, you know, so many of our traditions, particularly Abrahamic faiths, but not limited to them by any means, so often our faith traditions, as disparate as they are in many of their beliefs, we are all rooted generally in care for one another, care for community, self-determination, all of those values. I think the other thing for me on a personal level, I just have had several in the very recent past, but over the course of several years, these interfaith moments. There is an element of coming together to build power and to see systemic change, but the personal growth I think that's available when we explore those relationships together. I learned more about my own tradition, but particularly we're speaking with our Jewish brethren, but also from other Christian traditions as well. There are so many different lenses that we can look through our scriptures together, that we can think through our values together, the opportunity for personal growth, to not only understand these things for ourselves, but to understand how we can speak about it more effectively, how we can grow in so many other ways. It's a both and for me that I find a lot of value both in the systemic, what is possible, to make our dreams a reality for a better world, but also the personal growth that's available in interfaith spaces that, as much as I love my fellow Episcopalians, we have our view of things. To hear it from other perspectives is really, really enriching to me.
That was the first thing I put down. I learned so much about myself and my community through interfaith dialogue. I couldn't agree more. The other piece, though, also for me goes back to something we said at the very beginning, where we were, and you guys use different words. I often talk about benevolent care versus systemic change, but the faith community is really strong all over the country, but in particular in Delaware, in the housing sphere, when it comes to benevolent gifts. Code Purple is almost exclusively, you know, in the faith community's hands. All kinds of collections of money, clothes, things, right? Feeding people when they're unhoused. All of that is strong within the faith community, probably stronger in the faith community than in the secular community in some ways. Not all, but in some ways. But where the faith community often falls short is in the advocacy piece.
Yes.
Is in the actually saying, this is what I learned. I did this for, you know, X amount of months, and these are the people I saw. This is their story. This is what I learned, and this is what it teaches me about what we need to do. And I know from being in Dover and Annapolis that those stories are incredibly impactful and profound. So I want to try to provide venues for people who are already doing the day-by-day work, the one-on-one work, to really learn and teach others about that work so that we don't need to be the backbone of this work because we've systematically changed it. But the other reason goes back to a study that Pew did when I started my career back in the dark ages. And it said that even when legislators are not people of faith themselves, when people of faith walk into their office, they listen in a different way than when other people do. I don't understand it intellectually. It doesn't make sense to me, but I've experienced it in my own interactions with people. So if we have a muscle that can transform the world to be a better place, why wouldn't we use it? Right.
Absolutely.
So that to me is part of what this interfaith dialogue and this interfaith movement for housing advocacy that I'm trying to create in Delaware here is about for me. So we have had the privilege of talking, and you have been such kind listeners and quiet. I want to give you the opportunity to either give testimony or talk or speak, ask a question, whatever you choose to do. So we're small. Feel free to just come off mute if you'd like and share.
I figured I could at least come off of hiding my face, but I don't really have anything in particular to say other than I do feel like there is a significant role that the faith community in Delaware can and should be playing in advocacy. And I would like to be part of that and help get more folks working together from the faith communities in housing and other areas as well.
Mhm. Thanks.
I'll echo that. I'm find this interfaith effort very hopeful. I appreciate that the Housing Alliance of Delaware is creating these connections and community, and I'm hopeful. I'm a member of the First Unitarian Church of Wilmington and active in Peace Week. And it occurred to me through trying to connect through those circles that the Unitarian community is congregations are strong, but our clergy are part-time positions, serving multiple institutions, temporary appointments, living out of state. It dawned on me when we tried to tap into some of our. This is not no one's fault, by the way. It struck me as new information that that's how thin we are as far as leadership. So all the more reason for us to be connecting and working as coalitions when we're all that small and thin.
Yeah. Right.
Thank you. So Donna put in the chat, I appreciate this session. Thank you all for your insights. So Reverend Heather, are you coming off video and mute to say something, I hope?
Well, I thought I'd follow Julie because Julie, that was kind of a natural segue. It's my day off and beginning of Thanksgiving week, as you all know, so I am not in my ministerial garb at all. But I'm the full-time settled, not going anywhere minister of the Unitarian congregation in Sussex in Southern Delaware. And so I am glad to not be in transition in any of those ways that Julie just mentioned, though that is the case for a lot of our ministers for sure. But I feel very grateful to not be in that situation, but that doesn't mean that I don't feel stretched thin. I have 2 young children, as you've been seeing in the picture there. And it's just me in Southern Delaware. We're the only UU congregation in Sussex County. And I'm the only pastor, and the congregation is just turned 25 years old. And since the election, we've had 40 or 50 more people each Sunday. So that's great. except that it just makes me feel more like swamped trying to keep up with everybody who's coming in the door. And I appreciated, Reverend Fields, your distinction earlier between the slow work of trying to change things systemically versus or in concert with, not versus, but in concert with the mercy work, as you put it, because I'm just trying to make sure I have resources to hand out to people. Something that we're dealing with right now, you mentioned Code Purple, Rabbi Sonia, is that I'm hearing locally that Code Purple has not been very respectful, appropriate, or even welcoming of transgender, non-binary, genderqueer folks. And they are coming to our congregation in Sussex and asking for where they can get meals or shelter or support. So that's a whole other topic, but it's also a place where sometimes faith and mercy, social service work just create a whole lot more work and challenges rather than addressing the human need in a way that is respectful of who people are. So I don't know. That's all. Those were some of my thoughts. There's no end of work to do. But I do appreciate any opportunity to connect with other people who are interested in doing it.
Reach out to me, Reverend Heather, at a different time, and we could talk a little bit more, brainstorm how we can get those trans folks some support if it's not in Code Purple. So reach out to me and we can brainstorm a little bit together. Go ahead, Lynn.
So that made me think of something that I've been playing with my mind of how to get more people in our congregation to step into the advocacy space. And for those who don't know me, I'm with Westminster Presbyterian Church in Wilmington. And, you know, we have decades of history of working in the service of others, whether, you know, it's serving a Saturday breakfast or whatever the case may be. And there is no problem getting people to volunteer and to come out to do things with organizations. Yet we found it hard to move them into the advocacy space. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I just realized we need to tap into more is the fact that Friendship House, as an example, is starting to play a bigger role in advocacy. Mm-hmm. You know, a few years ago, that was not the case. Friendship House was not doing that. Our church has a long, long history with Friendship House. So the respect that everyone in our church has for Friendship House, the knowledge they have, the hours and dollars that they have poured into Friendship House is just huge and cannot be understated. So everyone knows about the work that they do. So when they see the executive director of Friendship House speaking out on these issues, that gets their attention. All of a sudden, they're like, oh, I need to do more than, you know, taking a meal to the transitional house this week. Oh, you know, there's more to be done. So I don't know how I'm going to use that yet, but this is a new thought that I need to somehow tap into that connection, because we've, you know, our Peace and Justice Work Group has spent the last few years feeling like we're knocking our head against a wall. Like, how do we get people to pay attention to what we, you know, want to do? So I think it's going to be tapping into what they already know and love and respect in Friendship House.
That's a great point, Landon. I just to name one of the things, I think, looking around the room, there are a lot of us who are part of mainline denominations, or a lot of us who are seeing very similar demographic changes over time. Our congregations are aging. I think about our context at SAM. You know, we used to have volunteers to do hundreds of meals every week. That benevolent care, that compassionate care side of the ministry work. Our folks are not able to physically do that any longer. But when you start to talk about how that didn't also, just doing that work on its own didn't shift the system, That work will always continue if we don't shift the system, if we don't change the rules of the game. And when we start talking about the relationships they have in the community, particularly relationships with people in power, organizations in power, it's very similar to that to leaning on Kim and Friendship House for that advocacy. It's also starting to name the power that we have as faith communities when we're properly mobilized to be in the public sphere, the amount of power we actually wield. The other side, to tag on to what Sonia mentioned about when people of faith, particularly ordained leaders, but not exclusively so, walk into the halls of power, the type of moral authority we have in those spaces and the way that we're listened to. And I think about this came up in Indianapolis, sorry to go geographically in a very different place, but when Reverend Heather was talking about, particularly children who are trans and queer and non-binary, it was very, very powerful when some of those issues were coming up in Indiana. Think about bathroom bans and gender affirming care bans, and the difference that it made for religious leaders to get up and speak powerfully about the dignity of these children, their worth, and to really, faith communities can shape those narratives in the public sphere differently than any other nonprofit can. And so there's a lot of power that we can wield properly, properly put out there. And so I just think there's a huge opportunity for us as faith leaders, lay and ordained, to be in the public sphere, shaping the narrative. Someone has to be able to talk about why we're talking about housing and the human dignity for the individuals that we're working with. It's not just about the numbers, telling the stories, to Sonia's point, shaping the narrative, talking theologically about why every human being's life not only matters that they're alive, but that they have the full dignity of everyone else. Faith communities have a special place in that work, and it's different work than making 100 meals on a Sunday morning.
And Reverend Heather reminded me, a statistic I don't use as often as I really should is because we don't have real numbers because it's a hidden homeless population.
Yeah.
But when you look at unaccompanied minors, usually 14 to 18, you are often talking about a member of the GLBTQIA community, whether it's international undocumented or it is American born and bred. They are people who have been kicked out of their house, who have been persecuted and don't have somewhere safe. They also know that if they are found, they will be sent home in one way or the other, and home is not safe. So they discover ways to stay hidden. So we don't have real numbers of unaccompanied minors, but that doesn't mean it's not a community that has been assaulted and is absolutely a strong piece of this story of homelessness, and one which the religious right has weaponized against and is going to become more weaponized against in the next 4 years. So offering another religious point of view that says that we don't need to do conversion therapy, we don't need to return them to abusive home, but we do need to give them housing, is going to be really vital to their staying alive. Because the suicide rate among trans kids is extraordinarily high, and it's just going to get worse.
And I could tell just one story where religious leaders taking an advocacy stance really made a difference. The parish I served last in White Plains, New York, years before I got there, they had a real homeless problem. And one winter they had 2 people freeze to death. And the leaders got together and they borrowed a coffin and they had a procession together to the county offices to dramatize the need for home. And that started things in motion, and it's still going very well, but that's the kind of thing that really got attention and a lot of respect. And of course they used the press and all that kind of stuff, but it made a difference.
Just real quick, and Lynn, I don't remember if I mentioned this when I was with your Peace and Justice group a couple of years ago, but I've had some success with kind of convincing people like, hey, let's try this justice thing, but I've seen people of faith run when there's friction, once friction starts. And friction's always going to start because people don't like it when you show up and say, here's a problem that you're not dealing with. There's always going to be friction. And one thing that I was not good at the beginning is kind of shepherding and preparing to say, hey, expect this. This is going to be a part of it. We're still going to be the people that we're going to be, but you need to know just because of what we're doing and the fact that we're calling out problems, that there and special interests and all of that. When you get into that, there's going to be friction. I do sometimes wonder if one good entry point for people of faith is showing up and telling stories. Like, can we do that? You know, like, or even if we don't have a story to tell, you know, going along with someone to tell their story at some kind of hearing or city council or whatever it is. That's there. I think there are a number of entry points, but one would be if somebody has a story, show up and tell it, or go along with the person who does. And you start to see kind of how those interactions are pointing to a bigger reality that we have to be a part of.
I think to one of the points some of the speakers made earlier in terms of moving people from the basic works of mercy and compassion care to being comfortable with advocating. I think a lot of people just are really scared off by that. They feel like they have to have all their talking points in a line and be on the right political side to be able to go to the state house or whatever. And it's almost like maybe a mini abridged version of community organizing 101, and just some of the basic things. And to Pastor Field's point, to be prepared. I served as a full-time missioner in Honduras. I'm a physician, and I've had quite a few run-ins with some of the locals. And just because, and as one of my friends said, just because you have a white coat and a cross around your neck, don't think they're going to welcome you with open arms when you say, how come we don't have any gloves in the ER at our local hospital for the poor? And so, you know, to prepare people, I think it's a leap to ask people to advocate without helping them to feel somewhat comfortable. And it is, it's you know, you're out of your comfort zone. It's a leap, but I think it's a skill set that one can learn. And even something as basic as letter writing, or writing a letter to the editor, your local paper, and let people know that as a member of SAMS, I strongly agree, or I strongly feel whatever, but get it out there and just help people kind of go along that learning curve, because it doesn't just happen.
Right. Thank you. I think that it's a really interesting topic that we could probably dive into, is whether friction is good or bad. I think that in Judaism, there's a concept called machloket, which is often translated as sacred arguing. And there's a whole body of literature about part of what we're meant to do is to argue for the sake, what's called for the sake of heaven, right? Argue to find the truth, not argue for the sake of earth, which is arguing to make a point, right? And there's rules around sacred arguing, which I don't always follow as well as I would like to. For example, you're supposed to represent person's point of view so fully before you counter it. Because can you really counter something if you haven't shown you can understand it? We tried doing that in board meetings. That didn't always work as well as I would have liked it to, but it's a skill. And I often think of knives when I think of friction. You need two sharp knives to sharpen a knife. And sometimes if we think of disagreement as a way of sharpening our own opinion, our own argument, it's not always as bad. And you don't have to be an enemy of someone to disagree with them. Right? So I throw that up as a different way of understanding friction. From a community that is said to have 3 Jews and 4 opinions, it's not surprising that I would think that. So we thought we would close out by sharing what we would like our interfaith community to do, what we think God is calling us to do. I will let one of the two of you go first and I'll go last. That's okay.
Do you want me to go first this time? I think you had it last time. All right. So, what would I like faith communities to do? You know, at SAM, we've been talking about housing and specifically looking at and asking the question of what is God calling us to do for quite a while. And we've really come across, we're kind of looking at three different buckets. So we have traditional, a lot of faith communities have traditional benevolent care ministries. That work is really important. The dignity and the care of individuals who are experiencing homelessness, like we can't, to Sonia's point earlier, if we let those go, many of those are not replicated anywhere else. And so it's not something that we can just let go. But moving into a space of advocacy, of activism, and I appreciate Barbara, and I may have a ministry idea for you. Thank you for speaking up. But I do think that
I'm
faith
sure you will.
communities are underutilized sources of political power, and not
Mhm.
political in the sense of partisan politics, but political into the sense that Pastor Fields was talking about of our body politic. And I do think that I would like to see faith communities lean into that more widely, being really targeted in the type of work they're looking at, but really strengthen those muscles to go into the public sphere and seek answers. Because to Barbara's larger point, I think the general public is scared to be in those spaces and advocate for others. And we, as members of faith communities, we advocate within our communities for people all the time. Taking that out into the public sphere is just an extension of that work. And then the third bucket that we've really been talking about is really the large scale dreaming of, to Lynn's point too, of building coalitions to make systemic change in the housing area, is to find ways to come together with other partners to make a dent in that 20,000 unit deficit. And so I know that sounds like an awful lot, but I think faith communities, if we actually, because the final piece of that is actually as the grassroots, if we can find possibilities to empower every single person in our community to live into their own given gifts, I would argue God-given gifts, but if we empower everyone to those individual gifts, activation in all those areas is not only possible, it's likely. And so if we start with identifying and empowering folks in their spiritual and practical gifts, I think we can attack all three of those areas. And I think that's where we're feeling God is calling us at SAM. But I don't think we're alone in that, because every time I turn around, we're finding connections with other communities that are thinking and being drawn into those same places.
Yeah.
Yeah, so amen to all of that. And I would just remind us of something that probably seems kind of obvious, but local faith communities are uniquely and well positioned to work on the local. And local is even more important now. We're seeing national ideology getting good at infiltrating the local. Just as an example, if you think about local school boards, a lot of times the people elected to such offices are friends and neighbors who say hi at the grocery store and know your kids from the swim team and all of that. They come to cleanup days, but in recent years, at local school board meetings all across the country, people are somehow showing up with the same messages at all these local school boards. Teachers are wolves in sheep's clothing, teaching you critical race theory. LGBTQ people groom our children. How is it that every local community and school board doing their own thing is starting to hear all the same messages? Well, that's because well-organized ideology on the national level is infiltrating the local, and we have to be a counterpunch to that. We have to say our local community, we are unique in many ways, and we are who we are, and we are a part of and love the local community. And so I'm probably uniquely Baptist in thinking about this too, because Baptists are the local church is autonomous and we don't have an authority structure. So we're doing our own local thing anyway. But love the local, work on the local. And I've even heard, U.S. representatives since this last presidential election say, don't forget about the local, don't forget about the state. That's where a lot of things are still going to happen.
Mhm.
So the faith communities are uniquely positioned. Be sure to stay there.
That's a good point.
Not just there, but don't neglect.
I put a link in the chat. Many of you actually already get my housing advocacy emails, but there's a few of you that names I don't recognize. If you click on that and scroll down, you can sign up to become a housing advocate. So that's just my commercial plug. My goal is to create a state movement where we have 5 to 10 housing advocate in every single house district. And I need your help to do that. So please feel free to sign up if you haven't already. My ask is really simple, and I apologize to those at Westminster. It was the same ask there. But I invite people to go home. You're already home, but they had to go home, and do 2 budgets. One, your budget of your resources, and the other, your budget of your time. And really think about how much you can give. Advocacy is one of the underfunded places. It is very hard to get money for advocacy. People like education, but they don't like talking about bills and they won't fund it. So resources are thin in any nonprofit that does advocacy. So pick your organization of choice. I have a vested interest in a housing alliance, but any advocacy organization that you believe in will be able to use your dollars. And then take a budget of your time. How many hours a week? How many hours a month? And it might be that you're doing it in a coffee clutch, talking to the person that you don't understand why they won't do advocacy. It might be by coming to Dover. It could be done in a lot of different ways. But, and I'm open to suggestions. My email I will put in because I can't talk and email at the same time, type at the same time. I'll put my email in a second. Feel free to email me if you have an idea of a program. I will be doing an advocacy 101 again in January. I do it every year in January. If you sign up as my housing advocate, then you'll get the notice of it. You can invite other people to come. We break down how to be an advocate, how to do testimony in very simple terms to make it as accessible to as many people as possible. Personally, I just look forward to continuing the conversations that we've been having all week in Faith and Housing Justice with each and every one of you until we get a home address for every Delawarean. Thank you, Reverend Fields. Thank you, Father Burke. Thank you to each and every one of you for coming out tonight on your day off, Reverend Heather. We really appreciate your presence, your advocacy, and everything you do. Good night, everybody.